Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout is a retired Marine Corps fighter pilot, an Indiana native and graduate of Purdue University, who I did tell him I did pick to win the national championship this year. Was commissioned on June 1st, 1981. It's a good year. And was designated a naval aviator on the 13th of May, 1983. His first fleet assignment was the F-4S Phantoms, which of course we have in our possession down south, at MCAS Beaufort, is that what you say? Beaufort, I apologize. Beaufort, South Carolina, should know, it's from the south. Following a stint as an instructor pilot at NAS Chasefield, Texas from 1986 to 1989. He transitioned to the FA-18 Hornet, flew the Hornet from bases on both coasts, and ultimately retired from the MCAS Miramar in 2001, which I did tell him is my favorite Marine Corps base, for obvious reasons. I'm a Top Gun fan. Aside from flying assignments, he served as the executive officer of 1st Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company and in a variety of additional assignments with various staffs around the world. During his 20-year career, he flew more than 4,500 flight hours, including 37 combat missions during Operation Desert Storm. Of course, he's also written how many books? 14 books, and he's promised us another one sometime this year. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the museum and the staff. This is a wonderful facility, and it just keeps getting better and better every year. I really enjoy coming here. And thanks to you all for spending a little bit of your time to learn a little bit more about the 352nd Fighter Group, of which that young fellow there, that handsome young man, Don Bryan, was a member, had been a member since the group's formation in late 1942, and stayed with them until nearly the end of the war. Don was a talented pilot, an excellent leader. He was credited with more than 12 aerial victories over the Germans during World War II. All around great guy. Don, before every combat mission, used to empty his bladder on the tailwheel of his aircraft. And he did that for a couple of reasons. The first, most practical reason was that a lot of the missions he flew lasted 4, 5, 6 hours, and that was his last chance to go. The second reason was more ritualistic. He had been doing this since the time he started combat operations, and he came back safely every single time. So he was not going to tempt fate, not going to bring bad luck on himself by stopping. On the other hand, during my short combat career, I did not empty my bladder on my aircraft's tailwheel, primarily because it did not have a tailwheel. And you'll notice how cleverly, how deftly I transition the focus of this discussion onto myself, because I am a former fighter pilot. As such, I love to talk about myself. Myself is my favorite topic. I love to hearken back to the time when I was prettier, when my neck didn't hurt, when my back didn't hurt, and my knees didn't hurt. Sadly for me, this conversation is not about me, but rather the 352nd Fighter Group, which flew with the 8th Air Force during World War II as part of the Strategic Air Campaign against Nazi Germany from 1942 to 1945. How many folks here have seen Masters of the Air or are familiar with Masters of the Air? 8th Air Force had 40 bomb groups, just like the 100th bomb group that you saw in Masters of the Air. They also had 15 fighter groups. The 352nd was one of those 15 fighter groups. Had anywhere from 40 to 70 aircraft, depending on the time of the war. They were activated in New England in early October 1942. They were made up of 3 squadrons, the 328th, 486th, and 487th. And no, I don't understand the numbering system that the United States Army Air Force has used. Had no rhyme or reason. So from October 42, the men trained Over a 5-month period, they trained at 5 different bases. And when you consider you got to move your aircraft, you got to pack up the equipment and the material, move all the men 5 different times, it made, well, not much time available for actual training. It was made up mostly of youngsters and non-careerists. And I love doing this little exercise with you all during these presentations. 1938, the United States Army Air Corps at that time was only made up of 28,000 men. 6 years later, in 1944, it was 2.4 million men. Now, let's pretend for a second there's 100 of us here. There's not quite, but let's say there were 100, and it's 1944, and we're all in the Army Air Forces. That means that only one of us, and it can be you, sir, only one of us had been on the job for 6 years or more. Everyone else was an amateur. And in fact, 80% of us wouldn't have enlisted or been commissioned until 1942, after Pearl Harbor. So 80% of us had been on the job for less than 2 years. It was remarkable. It was not always efficient. There were no computers. This was all typewriters and teletypes and stubby pencils and clipboards. This gentleman makes a good example. He was the commander of the 352nd in 1943. He had been commissioned in 1938. Remember, he's in charge of more than 1,000 men and 50 or more aircraft. Take any guesses at his age? To me, he looks 50, 55. He's 28 years old, and he had all that responsibility on his shoulders. The group was assigned to fly the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Was not a pretty aircraft. To me, it looks like a Sunday roast with wings. It's a very powerful aircraft, very heavy, almost outweighed its counterparts, its enemy counterparts, by double. Very solidly built, like a manhole cover, almost indestructible. Big engine, fast, powerful, carried 850 caliber machine guns, which essentially was as many machine guns as 2 infantry battalions in one aircraft. Was fast, operated at high altitude because it was intended or ended up serving as a fighter escort for the bombers as they entered Germany at high altitude, dove very fast so that it could chase people down, or if the pilot got into trouble, he could dive and get out of that trouble. Biggest problem with the P-47 was that initially it had very short range, didn't carry a lot of gas, and the gas it did carry, it went through very quickly. Now, we talked about the bulk of the men who made up the United States Army Air Forces as being new to the job. They were also very young. These pilots ranged anywhere from 20 to 25 years old. 20 to 25-year-old men are essentially grown-up boys, not quite grown-up boys, and they did stupid things. I don't care what generation they were from, greatest or not, my generation. Young men do stupid things. My friend Don McKibben, he's the one sitting closest to the fuselage on that wing there. He went out with his friend Ted Fahrenwald, and they went out on a training mission out of New England, and their objective, because they're stupid boys, was to get no higher than 10 feet above the ground. And so they took off, they raced all the way over New England, ended up over Long Island Sound. Very calm that day. My friend Don decides he's going to see how low he can get, and he ties the world's record for low altitude flight. Many people have done this. His propeller hit the water. He ended up crashing. A kind bystander paddled out there, hauled him aboard his boat, went back ashore, ended up back at the group headquarters that evening. And he's banged up, he's bruised up, he's cut up, his head's wrapped like he's the mummy. He goes in and reports to the deputy group commander, Eugene Clark, and he's standing at attention and he's telling Major Clark what happened. And Clark looks at him for a long 10 seconds, doesn't say anything, and he says, "McKibben, they're going to kill you. You are half dead anyway." And he reaches down, pulls his pistol out of its holster, puts it on the desk, slides it across to my friend Don, and says, "You just want to finish the job." But accidents like this, and due to other reasons, were the cause of most aircraft losses for the Americans during World War II. About 2/3 of the aircraft that were crashed and written off were lost in accidents. Accidents due to weather, accidents due to young men. One of the 352nd's aircraft crashed into Hofstra College. 4 men took off from the aircraft factory with brand new aircraft. All of them were killed trying to land in bad weather. Dozens of men of the 352nd were lost in aircraft crashes before they ever got to England. But they do arrive in England. July 8, 1943, I think they were the 4th or 5th fighter group to arrive and join the 8th Air Force. They're assigned to Royal Air Force Field Bodney, which doesn't have runways. It's just a nice, big, grassy, open field, which had its advantages. They could take off in any direction they wanted. When it got rainy and muddy, made it a little bit more difficult. They spent 2 months training, getting ready for combat, flew their first combat mission on September 9th, 1943, and saw absolutely nothing noteworthy. No enemy aircraft, nothing that was worth chasing. And that continued through the rest of September, continued through all of October, and then most of November. No encounters with enemy aircraft. And that was due to a couple of reasons. Number one, the higher-ups at the 8th Air Force wanted them to take baby steps first. The other reason was that the P-47 at that point had very short range. They would escort the bombers as far as they could, which wasn't far. It was about 240, 250 miles. German fighter pilots aren't stupid. They would just wait until the P-47s were at the limits of their range. When the P-47s turned around, then the German pilots would attack the bomber formations, as you may have seen in Masters of the Air. The bombers, to be worthwhile, had to hit all those targets demarcated in red, otherwise there was no sense in their existence, and they needed to be escorted by the fighters to those targets in red, but the fighters couldn't do it at that time. And this was a problem. Bomber losses during much of 1943 averaged out at about 6%. And you think about those odds and you go, okay, I go on this mission, I've got a 6 in 100 chance of getting shot down. Well, I'll take those odds. And I would too. But what happens is if you're flying a 25 mission tour, and later it was 30 and then 35 missions, that 6% starts to compound on itself such that you had, as a bomber crewman, only a 1 in 5 chance of surviving a 25 mission tour. Even if the loss rate was 3%, you only had a 1 in 2 chance of surviving that tour. And the head of the Army Air Forces turns to his materials guy, Barney Giles, and says, "Barney, I don't care what you do or how you do it, but you've got 6 months to get me a fighter that will take the bombers anywhere they need to go. And he hands him a big government checkbook and sends him off. One of the first things they did to try and extend the range of the P-47s was to give them external fuel tanks, drop tanks they were called. And here you can see a small one suspended under this P-47's belly. Later they got much larger and also attached them one to each wing, which did a great deal towards extending the range of the P-47. Finally, November 26, 1943, the 352nd encounters German fighters and scores their first aerial victory. It was against an Me-109, which you see pictured here. Me-109 had been around for a little while. It had actually fought in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, was reasonably fast, reasonably maneuverable, operated pretty well at high altitude, wasn't a real comfortable aircraft to fly. Tiny cockpit, you can see from the metal framing in the canopy, it was kind of difficult to see out of, difficult to see over the nose, kind of tough to see behind. Inasmuch it was a fighter pilot's job to see and shoot enemy aircraft, German pilots did pretty well with that crummy canopy arrangement. The other aircraft that the 352nd encountered in significant numbers was the FW-190. Similar to the Me-109 in terms of performance, it was a newer aircraft, a little easier to fly, easier to see out of the cockpit, not quite as good at high altitude, but a good performer overall. And guys like me and other fanboys love to take a look at these German aircraft and their American and Allied counterparts and try and figure out which one was the best. You know, this one's 20 miles an hour faster at this altitude. This one turns a little bit better. And in truth, it didn't matter. The performance was roughly similar, and it came down to pilot experience, timing, and to a very great degree, simple luck. Most aircraft shot down, most fighters shot down during World War II were ambushed. They were shot down by somebody they didn't see at all or didn't see until it was too late. Point I'm making is that all the fighters, American, German, British, were roughly similar in performance. 352nd had a couple hundred fighter pilots pass through during the war. A lot of personalities, a lot of big personalities. It produced 29 aces. Would love to talk about them all. Only going to concentrate on one or two personalities here. George Preddy is one. Little fella, you see him here, soaking wet, maybe 130 pounds. Grew up, small boy in North Carolina. His nickname was Mouse, number one, because he was small. Number two, he had little ears that stuck out, made him look like a little mouse. Smart kid, got bullied a little bit, but people learned soon not to bully him because he was described as tough as a boot, despite his size. Family experienced tragedy. His older sister died while giving childbirth. George was extremely intelligent. Graduated high school at 16. When he came of age, he decided that he wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot. And he went to the air facility at Pensacola, and they told him, "You're too small, you don't have any muscle mass, your spine is crooked, and you have too much blood pressure. Go home, bulk up, do some exercises, and come back." And he did a second time, and the Navy sent him home again. He went back a third time. The Navy sent him home again. Now, George was persistent. He was not stupid. George went to the United States Army Air Corps. They accepted him first time, became a fighter pilot. Here you see him with a P-40. With his unit, he was on his way to the Philippines when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. That unit was directed or diverted to Australia, and George participated in the early months of the defense of Australia, 1942. George, quiet fella, affable fella, excellent pilot. When he got a little liquor in him, he became not George. He became very loud, very garrulous, loved to gamble, got quite a reputation for being a difficult to control party man. Still, great pilot. He's on a training mission, has a mid-air collision, is very badly injured, sent home to recuperate to the States. Once he recovers, he shops himself around to the various fighter groups. His reputation has preceded him in some cases, but some folks in the 352nd believed in him, took him on, and he became an early leader in the 352nd. Was one of the few Thunderbolt pilots with the 352nd who scored multiple victories against the Germans in the P-47. Established himself as a leader and a talented pilot early on. And we'll talk more about George. As fearful as the German fighter pilots were, 352nd's fighter pilots hated the weather over England and the English Channel and the North Sea and Europe even more. Difficult enough to fly in bad weather. It's especially difficult when you're flying an aircraft that doesn't carry a lot of fuel. Don Dilling took off with the unit December 30th, 1943. Unit takes off, they get over Europe, they're escorting the bombers, they spot an enemy fighter. They drop their fuel tanks, chase after the fighter, lose him, can't find him, rejoin the bombers. Bombers go 10 minutes beyond where they were supposed to go. P-47 pilots are getting low on fuel. They turn around with the bombers. They're attacked by a flight of German fighters, get tangled up in a dogfight that they can't afford to get tangled up into because they don't have the fuel. Don Dilling dives into a set of clouds and escapes. His compass tumbles. He's not sure what direction he's headed in. Finally, he breaks out of the clouds, spots the Thames estuary in southern England, doesn't see any airfields, decides to land in a farmer's field, is going to belly land the aircraft because if he lands in a soft field with his landing gear down, the aircraft may tip over and destroy itself. A belly landing, all they'll have to do is change the propeller, maybe bang out some dents, and it'll be fine. So he does that. He belly lands in this farmer's field, slides back the canopy, unstraps, steps onto the wing, and then takes a very short step down to the ground, starts walking across the field. And here comes a group of school children chasing down the hill after him, and they're screeching at him. And he can't understand them, and he realizes that they're shouting at him in French. And as much French as he knows, he figures out that they're telling him the Germans are coming to hide. And he can't understand what the Germans are doing in the English countryside. Wait a second. He had actually landed in France rather than England, ran off into the woods, actually joined with the French underground, and was eventually repatriated back to the United States. Two others of his squadron had done the same thing, set down, belly landed, ended up as prisoners of war for the duration. You'll remember my friend Don McKibben, who went motorboating in his P-47. Took off in poor weather with the rest of the fighter group. He's in a flight of 3. They get airborne. Almost immediately, they are in heavy clouds, and he is tucked in as close as he can to his flight leader. Wingman on the other side is likewise tucked in very close, trying to maintain sight of him as they climb through these clouds. And they're climbing through maybe 2,000 feet. Unbeknownst to them, in the flight in front of them and above them, one of the pilots loses sight of his formation lead, pulls back on the throttle, backs away to make sure he doesn't run into anyone in his flight, and instead backs into Don McKibben's flight leader. Both aircraft are badly chopped up. Don McKibben's flight leader is killed. The other wingman pulls hard away from the flight leader, loses control of the aircraft, crashes, is killed. Don likewise banks hard away from his flight leader, likewise loses control of his aircraft, and is forced to bail out at very low altitude. bails out, pulls his parachute D-ring, parachute deploys, snaps him to a stop. His feet get tangled up in the parachute shrouds. First aid kit comes loose, slams him in the face. He's all bloody, breaks out of the clouds, untangles his feet just in time to, bam, come down in a farmer's field. And it's not 15 seconds later, he's still collecting his wits and trying to stand up. And he looks across the field, and out of the farmhouse comes this old English lady, and she's trotting at him, and she's got a tray with a teapot and teacups and biscuits, going to make it all better for him. The English were very gracious hosts. My wife, Mrs. Wonderful, and I met with Dawn 6 or 7 years ago. Dawn was very gracious, still very intelligent, very charming, a wonderful gentleman. And my wife explained to me that if I should have an accident, for instance, if she pushed me off a cliff, that Mac was going to be her backup man. The fighter pilots loved being fighter pilots. It was exciting, it was adrenaline-fueled, it was all the glory that they had anticipated when they read the comic books growing up, but it was dangerous. This photograph is from early 1944. It's from a scrapbook, and the owner of the scrapbook had put an X over every member of that photo who had been shot down and lost. I think the big fella on the right is a ground officer, and you can see that 6 out of 8 of those pilots were shot down. This was dangerous business. Big things started happening for the 352nd March of 1944. They transitioned from the P-47 to the P-51 Mustang. And if the Spitfire, the British Spitfire, was the most beautiful aircraft ever made, I'd offer that the P-51 was the most handsome aircraft ever made. This was not a project of the United States Army Air Forces. Instead, the British Purchasing Commission stopped by the North American Aircraft Plant in 1940 and said, "Hey, can you make Curtiss P-40s for us under license?" And North American said, "Well, yeah, but we can build you something better." And the Brits said, "Well, show me, do it. But you got 100 days to do it." And in fact, they did meet that deadline. They had a flying prototype within 100 days. Great airplane, the P-51A, turned really well, had very long range, it was fast, it was powerful, but it only had a single-stage supercharger, which meant that it would be no good at high altitude to escort the bombers. So what they did was mate this aircraft with the same engine that powered the British Spitfire, gave it a two-stage supercharger, and the result was that aircraft you see. And it was a world beater. It was faster than everything else out there, good high-altitude performance, good for escorting the bombers, very maneuverable, and had outstanding range. However, it was a little fussy maintenance-wise, only carried 4 machine guns, half of what the P-47 carried. A little bit more difficult to maintain. Spark plugs would foul, the brakes were problematic, but still, the guys loved it. Flew their first mission, March 6, 1944. And by that time, enough improvements had been made to the P-47. They had introduced the twin-engine P-38, and now they had the P-51. And the 8th Air Force's fighter groups could now take its bombers wherever they needed to go. And that was bad news for the Luftwaffe. Now the German fighter pilots had to defend or had to engage. The American fighter crews were very well trained and very well equipped, and they started taking massive losses. Still, a very dangerous game, no matter whose side you were on. Steve Andrew, P-51 pilot with the 352nd, shot down an FW-190. Pilot bailed out at very close range. This is from Steve Andrew's gun camera film. That German pilot landed right in the center of the propeller of Steve Andrews' aircraft. You can imagine he was chopped to bits. Eventually the body fell away. Steve Andrews' wingman, Lloyd Rauch, was so nauseated he took off his boot, threw up in it, threw it overboard. Back over the English Channel, he realized that his one remaining boot was useless, took that off, also threw it overboard. As I mentioned, the German fighter pilots were now forced to engage those American escort fighters. And the problem was that Germany had not planned for a long war, and they could not replace their pilots as quickly as they were shot down. So the replacement pilots, less skilled, less experienced, shot down that much more quickly, and the replacement pilots for them were even less well skilled. And so it was a death spiral for the Luftwaffe. Spring of 1944, the average lifespan of a German pilot over Northern Europe was 90 days. It typically took 3 shoot-downs to kill a pilot. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, half of its aircraft over Northern Europe, half of its fighters were shot down every single month. Good news was that the pilots got to fly new aircraft. Bad news was that they were sure to get shot down very quickly. So air superiority had been largely established by June of 1944. We're talking D-Day. Air superiority is what made D-Day possible. Over the beachhead, the Allies were able to put 171 fighter squadrons over the beaches. Not talking aircraft, we're talking fighter squadrons, 20 aircraft or more. Their dominance was overwhelming. That morning, the weather was horrible, and the pilots were compelled by operational necessity to take off in the dark between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, very low clouds, very low ceiling. Robert Frescati of the 352nd took off on that grass airfield at Bodny, got slightly off course, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, struck a control tower that was under construction. Enormous fireball, and you can see the aftermath of that. He was the 352nd's only loss that day. I'd like to make the point that as much as we talk about the pilots, it makes interesting reading, that's the glorious bit. None of those pilots could have done anything without the support personnel. And for every one pilot in the 352nd, there were 10 support personnel. These were the mechanics, these were the clerk typists, these were the cooks, the bakers, the candlestick makers. You might ask, Grandpa, what did you do during World War II? And he might say, I was at the supply depot with a fighter group. Doesn't sound very exciting, but it was absolutely essential to the war effort, and I think it's important we remember these people. Girls, everybody loves them, and so did the men of the 352nd. England was one of the few theaters of war where the men were actually able to date in the local population, and they did. Many of them got married. They had big parties, and believe it or not, the standing order was, after these big dance parties, if you have a girl stay overnight, you've got 3 days to get her off of the base. So Grandpa had pretty liberal policies back then. A lot of tragic stories, as you might imagine. One pilot was dating an English gal, and he was killed. Eventually, she started dating another 352nd pilot. He was killed, and the pilots made arrangements such that she was no longer allowed aboard the base, either for bad luck or as a black widow. But a lot of tragedy accompanied these relationships for obvious reasons. Nose art. You have your obligatory semi-nudes. You had your clever phrases. You had all sorts. Unless it got especially obscene, the sky was the limit. Now, William Wisner, he had not yet put nose art on his particular P-51. And at the same time, there was a delegation coming from the royal family to visit the 352nd. Good relations. Among that royal family was Princess Elizabeth, who eventually became Queen Elizabeth, and they told Wisner, hey, your aircraft is now Princess Elizabeth. He's like, I don't want my airplane to be Princess Elizabeth. Didn't matter. His airplane was Princess Elizabeth. Just shortly before the princess came to see her airplane, they realized it was parked next to X-Lax, shit and git. They just had a few minutes to clear that aircraft out and avoid a kerfuffle with the royal family. The commander of the 352nd, we met him earlier, Joe Mason, he had his aircraft painted, "This is it," with an exclamation point. And his wife wrote him and said, "Did you name your aircraft over me?" And he wrote back and said, "Well, of course I did, dear." And she said, "Oh, great, send me photographs." He's like, duh. So above, "This is it," he had his wife's name stenciled. Gina, this is it. George Preddy, we talked about him earlier. He named his aircraft Cripes-a-Mighty because when he rolled the dice playing craps, he always shouted, "Cripes-a-Mighty." Well, August 5th, 1944, weather's going to be really crummy. There's no mission scheduled for the next day. There's a war bond tour going on at the 352nd, lots of partying, lots of dancing, lots of drinking, lots of gambling. George Preddy wins himself $1,200 cash. Now, in today's money, I think that's enough to buy the state of Delaware or maybe a Taylor Swift concert ticket. Anyway, George goes to bed early in the morning. He is beyond drunk. They wake him up a couple hours later and they say, "George, weather's cleared, big mission's on, and you're scheduled to lead it." Stumbles out of the rack, collects all the data he can, goes to the briefing hut, climbs aboard the podium, falls off the podium. Joe Mason turns to somebody and said, "Jesus Christ, Preddy's still drunk." And they're like, "We'll take care of it." So they stuff George with coffee, make him a wide-awake drunk. Anyway, he ends up taking off, leading the entire fighter group, vomits in his cockpit several times. They encounter a huge formation of German fighters. George Preddy ends up setting a record by shooting down 6 German fighters in one sortie. To that point, it had never been done before. The media embraces it. George becomes a public darling. He is America's fighter pilot. War goes on through the summer and the fall. The Allies are dominating. December 15th, 1944, the Germans, in a last desperate gamble, launch what becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge. And it is very ugly for the Allies and the Americans at that time. The 352nd is sent out of England to an expeditionary field, Y-29, near Asch in Belgium. And they operate out of there. It's cold, it's miserable, they're intense, but they're doing good work. Christmas Day, 1944, George Preddy is scheduled to lead a mission, and he's laughing and joking. He's a very successful ace. By this time, he's become a squadron commander. Everybody loves George, and he's showing off his Christmas socks that his family had sent him. They were red and white striped. They take off in good spirits. They encounter, at very low level, a formation of German fighters. And George shoots down 2 more fighters, and he's chasing a 3rd over the treetops, and he is shot down by anti-aircraft fire, crashes, and is killed. And the salt in the wound is that he was shot down by an American anti-aircraft gun unit. Obviously, morale took a hit due to the loss of George Preddy. New Year's Day, January 1945, The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is being dominated at every turn. They are beat down, but they marshal their resources for one more last gasp effort, Operation Bodenplatte. They get together 1,000 fighters with which they are going to mount an early morning strike. Right at dawn, New Year's Day, 1945, they're going to hit Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And they take off. Meanwhile, John Meyer, commanding officer of the 352nd 487th Squadron, just on a hunch, just on a feeling, gets permission to lead a patrol just at dawn, New Year's Day, 1945. And as he is taking off, the German fighters attack. And he sees a German fighter crossing from right to left as he's rolling down the runway, gets airborne, lifts his gear, arms his guns, turns his gun sight on, squeezes the trigger, and shoots down that German fighter right on the airfield. And they're developed to be an air battle unlike anything before or since. Most of the ground personnel of the 352nd had never seen a German aircraft, much less a dogfight. What took place was almost like a grand sporting event. Almost entirely within the perimeter of that airfield, the 352nd's fighter pilots engaged these German pilots, and over the course of about an hour and a half, shot down 23 German aircraft for losses of 0. They had a couple of aircraft damaged on the ground. Certainly a spectacular event, the likes of which will never be seen again. The Germans did destroy about just short of 300 aircraft on the ground. Didn't kill many pilots because everybody was in bed. Allies could easily replace those aircraft losses within about a week, and they did so. The Germans, on the other hand, lost more than 200 pilots. They couldn't afford to lose those pilots, and the German Air Force really never recovered during the last few months of the war. Tragedy never left the Preddy family alone. Older sister dies in childbirth. George is killed. George's little brother, William Preddy, arrived after New Year's Day, the closing months of the war, was credited with 2 aerial victories during a time when most fighter pilots never saw a German aircraft, was strafing with his wingman a German airfield in Czechoslovakia. Both of them were shot down and killed. So the 352nd finishes the last few months of the war. They do encounter the jet age, the Me-262. They score a few successes. 262 would have been a problem had it been introduced a year later, or a year earlier, but it was just too little, too late. 352nd finishes the war along with the rest of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups. Ultimately, after the end of the war, they are disestablished and have essentially disappeared into history. This is a contemporaneous scoreboard for the 352nd, created by the men of the 352nd. It's a lot of numbers, but what I will say is that they were a very high-scoring group. They had the 2 highest scoring Mustang pilots in history, George Preddy being number 1, J.C. Meyer we saw number 2. They were also the 3rd and 4th highest scoring aces in the European Air War. I think it was a mixture of leadership, timing, and luck that made them such a standout organization. I love this photo. That fellow looks like he's excited about something. I don't know what, but he has something to say. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.